Thank you so much for being here today. Mutual Aid
Yeah.
New World is possible through solidarity. Alrighty, and so I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Yenny Bencomo Suarez. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I identify as a very neurodivergent Cuban, Caribbean, Latina, cross-cultural community organizer, violence preventionist, sex educator, and abolitionist. I have over 6+ years of experience in community organizing, from organizing mutual aid efforts as well as union work with SEIU. I have lots of experience throughout Kentuckiana, sustaining mutual aid networks and movement work. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Latin American Latino Studies and a minor in Middle Eastern Islamic Studies from the University of Louisville from 2020. I'm also a recipient of different U.S. State Department programs of having studied in the Middle East and North Africa as well. So that is what drew my interest into studying about that as well. I currently work as a sex educator at a statewide nonprofit in Indianapolis. I'm also a PACER peer at the IU School of Medicine, and I serve on the leadership team at IDJ. Outside of that realm, I love plants. I love reading a multitude of different books, and I love traveling across the global South. All right.
Yenny, can we explain the language before you go anymore? Because we do have some Spanish speakers here.
Absolutely. Yes. Please tap in. Are we going to have one of the interpreters explain that piece for us today?
Jaime, would you mind doing that? If not, we're gonna drop the instructions in the chat,
Yeah.
and we can probably do both. Oh, Jaime's probably on the channel.
Oh, wow. I guess I'm doodling
Okay.
on my own PowerPoint. Okay, let's go for it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna do my best to explain this. For the folks who are using ASL, the interpreters should always be visible to you. We're going to use pinning to do that. And so for the folks who would like to hear this webinar in Spanish, I would like you to go to the little world icon at the bottom of your screen. It should be a circle and have the word interpretation underneath. I need you to select the language of your choice. If you are an English speaker, please select English. If you are listening in English, please select English. If you want to listen in Spanish, please select Spanish. And you will need to do that every time. And so I'm going to. So that's what it sounds like in Spanish. I think that's everything. I appreciate you making space to do that, Yenny. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're good. Thank you for keeping me in the loop as always, Sierra. I really appreciate you helping moderate this program for today. Alrighty, so I believe that's sorted. So we're gonna go on with community agreements for today. Let's try to use I terminology and that we're all here today, challenged by choice, that we are choosing to challenge ourselves to learn and unlearn new things and attending with an open mind, and that we're all learning, and say it ugly, right? That's why I like to say, usually when I'm done presenting, I like to turn off the cameras so that folks feel comfortable asking the kinds of questions that they want in a safe space where that's going to be received, and people ask what they want to ask. All right. Let's go further. All right, and so our agenda objectives for today is, of course, to learn what mutual aid is, as well as understanding the links between vulnerability of disabled folks to sexual violence, as well as understanding intersectionalities and how mutual aid can be a tool and be a protective factor against DV and SV, so domestic violence and sexual violence, especially for folks who have disabilities. All right. However, before I can go any further with our presentation today, I do want to speak up about what is happening around the world. So before I proceed with this webinar, I want to disrupt the notion of business as usual during an ongoing genocide being committed against the Palestinian people, fully endorsed by our government and with our tax dollars. And as workers functioning across a multitude of intersectional movements, from reproductive health, rights and justice movement and disability justice movements to violence prevention, here at Indiana Disability Justice, we are joining collective international efforts to call for a permanent ceasefire and end to the US funding of the genocide of Palestinians, as well as the release of all hostages, including the thousands of Palestinian hostages held by Israel, many of them children, and an end to occupation and the ability of Palestinians, including those in diaspora, to freely return to their homes, and an end to the suppression of worker voices in the movement and in the field in support of Palestine. As I speak, over 1.9 million people in Gaza have been forcibly displaced from their homes, as their homes have been destroyed by Israeli airstrikes during a cold, rainy winter. Not to mention, over 30,000 Palestinians have been slaughtered since October 7th. About half of them are children. This death toll does not include the thousands still stuck and buried in the rubble, and over 25,000 Palestinian children have lost either one or both parents. Tens of thousands of injuries, including a growing number of amputations, and many of these procedures are currently being done without any access to anesthesia. So think about the cruelty behind that. And acquired disabilities are a symptom of militarism, occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism. So we fervently call for a permanent ceasefire, an immediate cessation of US funding contributing to the Palestinian genocide, the release of all hostages, including the numerous Palestinian children held by Israel, and an end to the occupation, and an unequivocal end to the suppression of Palestinian civil liberties, and an end to apartheid. Reproductive justice, which is defined as the human right to maintain bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that we have in a safe and sustainable community. Disability justice is the social justice movement, which focuses on examining disability and ableism as they relate to other forms of oppression and identities such as race, class, and gender. So both disability and reproductive justice demands that we analyze systems of power as we reject discriminatory power based on white supremacy, gendered and sexualized violence, and capitalist autocracy. And it demands that we take the histories of our communities, colonization, and reproductive oppression into account as we identify causes of issues and envision a better future for us all. And as Audre Lorde wrote, there is no such thing as a single issue because we do not live single issue lives. And it is imperative to contextualize the tragic events that happened on October 7th within a broader historical framework, recognizing that the Palestinians have endured a staggering 75 years of displacement, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing since 1948 Nakba, or as known in English, the catastrophe. And this catastrophic event forcibly expelled Palestinians from their home, setting the stage for a prolonged and deeply unjust situation. Notably, the ongoing bombings, including the devastating aftermath, are sustained by our taxpayer money, with the annual allocation of $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel. And this financial support exacerbates the already unbearable conditions for Palestinians, serving the interests of Western powers. And Gaza, under a 16-year siege imposed by Israel, grapples with a choked economy, a crumbling medical system, leading to critical shortages of essential resources like food, fuel, medicines, including anesthesia. And the spatial concentration of disability in refugee camps in Gaza and direct consequence of the occupation's violence compounds the challenges further, burdening an already overstressed infrastructure with each act of warfare. And moreover, the United States is systematically disinvesting in communities nationwide, disproportionately affecting disabled, neurodivergent, and negatively racialized communities. And the disruption and literal dismemberment of families emerge as urgent reproductive and disability justice issues. And it's crucial to acknowledge that disability justice cannot flourish under the oppressive conditions of settler colonialism, military occupation, imprisonment, and apartheid. We unequivocally express our solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, dignity, self-determination, and recognizing that disability justice demands unwavering support for the Palestinian people. And at the core of disability justice lies the principle of collective liberation, underscoring the interdependence of our liberation with that of others, and that disabled Palestinian lives hold intrinsic value, like all disabled lives around the world. And despite facing immense challenges, Palestinians cherish and impart the essence of life. And what they seek is a fair chance to live it. Currently, the Israeli government airstrikes have decimated numerous hospitals, including Al-Shifa Hospital, Al-Ahli Hospital, leaving over 2/3 of them inoperable, and their healthcare system on the brink of collapse. A critical shortage of sexual and reproductive health care compounds the crisis, with over an estimated 50,000 pregnant individuals lacking proper prenatal care. And this dire situation forces people to undergo C-sections without sedation, exposing pregnant individuals and newborns to acute infections and diseases. And this violence continues to unfold against the backdrop of an apartheid system and occupation. Halting federal aid and genocidal violence is pivotal for our own liberation. As documented by Amnesty International, numerous police forces undergo training in Israel, and putting an end to violence in Palestine is directly tied to enhancing our own safety and disability justice. And it is unacceptable to permit that global police forces continue to import brutal tactics into our community. And just as we vehemently oppose Cop City in Atlanta, we must cease both the importation and exportation of these violent policing tactics. And our credibility in the fight against sexual violence is compromised when we tolerate it as a tool of oppression in our prisons and our wars. And while our government neglects canceling student debt, investing in education, providing universal healthcare and housing, and improving infrastructure, especially for those with disabilities, billions of taxpayer dollars are funding the tragic loss of life of Black and Brown lives in the global South. So we stand united with our social justice colleagues in expressing the profound concern of the US government's use of authority to stifle those who criticize the genocidal actions of political leaders, often erroneously conflating such criticism with anti-Semitism. And this dangerous conflation of equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism poses a significant threat to our comrades, including both Palestinians and Jews, who have jointly advocated for a ceasefire and an end to occupation and apartheid. And in recent months, we have witnessed a powerful alliance between Palestinians and Jewish individuals calling for justice. And the suppression of dissidents by the government not only obstructs organizing efforts, but poses a direct threat to the principles of free speech and expression that we absolutely uphold. And as we navigate the path forward, we must steadfastly reject the government's manipulation of violence as a means to escalate criminalization and surveillance. We staunchly reject the need for permission from others to uphold justice, and in an era fraught with mischaracterization, remain resolute in our defiance, persistently demanding justice out of a profound love, not only for Palestinian lives, but for all lives. And we hold them close in their sacredness, just as we do for our Jewish lives. And our voices will not be silenced, nor be intimidated into submission. Free Palestine. So with that being said, we're going to keep going onward. These are the journalists on the ground in Gaza or in diaspora that folks should be following on Instagram, like Motaza Zaiza, Bisan, Plestia, Yara Eid, Lama Yamus, who is the youngest journalist, who's only 9 years old, Hind Khorderi, Anat International, Heba Akilia, Zuhail Nassar, Wael Aldo, translating Gaza, and some of our doctors who have been doing important work in Gaza and outside of Gaza, including Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta and other journalists as well. So if you all want to take a screenshot of that, do what you will. And here are the healthcare organizations to support disabled folks in Gaza, the West Bank, and Palestinian refugee camps, including the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund and Hassan Abu Sitta's Children's Fund. Ceasefire now. Alrighty, so since I've talked a lot about oppression, I want to define oppression. So oppression is the systematic and institutional abuse of power at the expense of others and the use of force to maintain this dynamic. And it's an oppressive system built around the ideology of superiority of some groups and inferiority of others. And this ideology makes those designated as inferior feel confined, less than, and hinders the realization of their full spiritual, emotional, physical, psychological well-being and potential. All right. And so what do we need to do to counter oppression? We need to build new systems from the bottom up rooted in our communities. And that is where mutual aid comes in. Alrighty, so mutual aid. Mutual aid is the collective coordination to meet each other's needs, usually from the awareness that the systems we have in place are not going to meet them. And so mutual aid is the cooperation for the sake of common good. It's getting people to come together to meet each other's needs and recognizing that as humans, our survival is dependent on one another. You can also define mutual aid as a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, not just through symbolic acts or putting pressure on their representatives in government, but by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. There's nothing new about mutual aid. People have worked together to survive for all of human history. The framework of mutual aid is significant in the context of social movements resisting capitalist and colonialist domination, in which wealth and resources are extracted and concentrated, and most people can survive only by participating in various extractive relationships at the expense of others. And so for providing for one another through coordinated collective care is radical and it's generative. And effective social movements always include elements of mutual aid into their movement work. So going further into what is mutual aid, again, it's a practice in politics that emphasizes solidarity rather than charity. So divesting from ideas of saviorship and understanding that all of us are vulnerable to systems of oppression. So instead of looking at the houseless person who is on the street and somehow you are the savior, understanding that the systems we have in place makes us have a lot more in common with our houseless neighbors than we do with millionaires and billionaires. So it means that we recognize our well-being, our health, our dignity are all bound up in each other. And it means that we understand that our survival depends on cooperation, not competition. So it's getting people together in our community to provide material support for each other, building relationships with your neighbors based on trust and common interest, making decisions by consensus rather than relying on authority or hierarchy, and sharing things rather than hoarding things, and treating nobody as disposable, providing all kinds of supports ranging from food prep to childcare, to translation, to emotional supports, and recognizing the value in all of them. And so right now, social movements have two pretty gosh darn big jobs right now. Social movements in the United States need to organize to help people survive the devastating conditions unfolding every day. And second, social movements need to mobilize hundreds of millions of people for resistance so we can tackle the underlying causes of these crises. And so effectively addressing these twin objectives, meeting people's immediate needs and mobilizing them for resistance, requires the establishment of mutual aid projects with widespread participation. Mutual aid, although often less visible and undervalued in movement work, so it's the type of work that people don't, see as sexy, right? It's not like people are doing direct actions. It's not like people are out here getting arrested, right? It's still very crucial work. Has been integral to successful social movements that have achieved significant change. And the current moment underscores that our capacity to build robust mutual aid networks will determine whether we can realize the transformative world we aspire or to further plunge into crisis. And recognizing that individuals often join these organizations out of immediate needs, such as eviction defense, childcare, social connection, healthcare, or advocacy, and the provision of support through mutual aid projects becomes a pivotal condition for their active political participation. And these projects not only offer crisis assistance, but can also contribute to breaking down the stigma and isolation by incorporating a political analysis of the systemic conditions that led to the crises in the first place. Mutual aid is not quid pro quo transactions. Mutual aid is not only for disasters or crises. And I know that the word became very popularized around COVID-19. However, mutual aid has existed for incredibly long time, well before even colonialism. And charity or a way to save people, that is not what mutual aid is about. It's also not a reason for social safety nets to not exist, okay? And we know that in recent years, as what I was alluding to, there has been a resurgence of interest in mutual aid, driven in part by digital communication and social media, and during crises like natural disasters or the COVID-19 pandemic. Decentralized networks of individuals and groups have organized to provide direct assistance to those in need, showcasing the adaptability and relevance of mutual aid principles. And we know that mutual aid has evolved and adapted over time, reflecting the changing needs and contexts of different communities. Before I go further into mutual aid, I also want to talk about as to another reason why people are looking into mutual aid is because of the often ongoing limitations of the nonprofit industrial complex. So what is the nonprofit industrial complex? It refers to the potential challenges and drawbacks associated with the growth and influence of nonprofit organizations, particularly those in sectors like international development, social services, and advocacy. And the limitation of the nonprofit industrial complex can include bureaucracy and overhead. So folks argue that that oftentimes large nonprofits may become bureaucratic and have high administrative overhead. And this could result in a significant portion of funds being allocated to other quote unquote operational costs rather than addressing the intended social issues. And with those fundings, oftentimes a lot of nonprofits fail to realize that their project staff are usually the OG crew of folks that are disabled, that are queer, that are people of color, that have endured poverty, that have endured systems of oppression, that need good salaries themselves in order to sustain that kind of important, crucial work that's ahead. And a lot of nonprofits tend to sacrifice their own workers through allocating their funds elsewhere, right? There's also that kind of mission drift. So nonprofits oftentimes face the challenge of that, where the organization's original goals and values become diluted or compromised over time. And this can happen as organizations seek funding from diverse sources, potentially leading to a shift in priorities to align with the interest of donors rather than the needs of the communities that they serve. And also those kinds of competitive dynamics, right? So increased competition for funding and resources can create a dynamic where nonprofits vie for each other for limited supports. And this can oftentimes result in a duplication of efforts and inefficiencies, with a focus on securing funding rather than delivering effective programming. And also with that dependency on funding resources, such as government grants, foundations, individual donations, that can create vulnerabilities, right? And shifts in funding priorities. You know, if you're taking money from a corporation that may not want you to condemn injustice or condemn oppression, that's going to have a significant impact on the kind of work that you're doing, right? Tokenization and power dynamics. So in the cases, nonprofits may tokenize the communities that they serve, treating them as beneficiaries rather than active participants and folks who have a say in the world that we're trying to create. And that can enforce power imbalances and hinder genuine community empowerment and collaboration. There's also lack of accountability that happens, right? While nonprofits are expected to be accountable to their beneficiaries and donors, that lack of transparency can be a limitation, right? Where they're not as transparent to the communities that they're serving, right? As well as that kind of limited innovation and adaptability because of the bureaucratic nature in which folks are operating in. The rigidity in structures and processes can make it challenging for these organizations to respond quickly to emerging social issues or changing circumstances, right? Professionalism and elitism. The professionalization of this kind of work can lead to that kind of elitism with a focus on academic credentials over lived experiences. And that could limit the inclusion of grassroots organizations and community leaders who may lack, quote unquote, qualifications from, you know, accolades and institutions like academia, but genuinely have valuable insights and experience through their lived experiences. As well as a dependency in issues, right? Where nonprofits become overly focused on specific issues or causes. And while specialization is important, right? That oftentimes can diminish their ability to make those kinds of connections and intersectionalities to strengthen wider multi-generational, working class, multiracial social movements, and a neglect of broader systemic issues. And again, those kinds of interconnected challenges, as well as the potential for greenwashing or poverty porn. Nonprofits oftentimes face criticism for engaging in, you know, greenwashing. So misleadingly portraying environmental efforts when really they're not tackling the root causes of climate change, right? Which is overconsumption, which is greed, corporate greed, right? Or poverty porn, where we're pimping out folks in the community rather than, again, being in solidarity of them. We're reaching for saviorship rather than trying to talk about what creates poverty, which is capitalism, right? Poverty is a man-made issue. And this can undermine the authenticity of their messaging and the credibility of their work. And last but not least, that kind of co-opting of social movements and controlling dissidents, right? So when we see grassroots organizations advocating for abolition, advocating for alternatives to public safety and ways to address the social issues that we're seeing, a lot of nonprofits tend to take that as threatening and they steer away from that, right? Notice how in 2020, a lot of people were demanding an abolition of the police and proposing new systems and new ways of how to keep our community safe. And a lot of nonprofits steered away by that and talked about reform rather than revolutionary efforts to transform the world that we're in. So how can grassroots efforts expand our movements in comparison to nonprofits, right? Community ownership and engagement, right? Grassroots movements typically emerge from within communities, allowing for a sense of ownership and direct engagement. People directly affected by issues are often deeply involved, leading to a more authentic representation of community needs and concerns, as well as that kind of flexibility and adaptability, right? Oftentimes grassroots movements and efforts are more adaptable to changing circumstances, and they can respond quickly to emerging issues and adjust their strategies based on real-time feedback from the community without the bureaucratic processes that oftentimes nonprofits are plagued by. as well as holistic and intersectional approaches, right? Recognizing the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression, right? So this kind of comprehensive understanding allows them to address root causes and advocate for systemic change. And because grassroots movements are deeply embedded in their communities, this allows for a more nuanced understanding of the specific challenges that are faced by communities, right? Whether we're talking about disability injustice, houselessness, substance misuse, this kind of localized knowledge can be instrumental for crafting effective solutions tailored to the actual needs of the people, right? Grassroots movements oftentimes excel in mobilizing communities and fostering a sense of solidarity. And people are more motivated to participate when they feel a direct connection to the cause and see the impact on their daily lives. And using direct action tactics and civil disobedience to bring attention to their causes. These actions can help disrupt the status quo, garner media attention, and create a sense of urgency to the issues that they are addressing. And they're able to do that because they're not as dependent on institutional funding. They're more sustained by the passion and commitment of their members and people willing to give money to those kinds of efforts, right? So it allows them to maintain a greater degree of autonomy and in settling their agendas, right? More of a bottom-up decision-making process as well as being more culturally informed, right? If you're from those communities, you can have a better understanding of that, right? Maybe you speak the language of those people, whether, metaphorically speaking or literally speaking, right? Whereas a lot of the decision makers in nonprofits tend to be disproportionately upper class and white, right? And really, this helps bring social capital, right? And when you have social capital, that's how we can build wider movements and success in our movements as well. Let me check the chats to see. I appreciate everyone commenting in the comments. I appreciate that. All right. So next slide. All right. And mutual aid is also anti-authoritarian, right? Mutual aid is getting people together in your community to provide that kind of material support to each other, right? And so they're better able to do that because it's more of operating on an anti-authoritarian ethos, right? Showcasing collaborative efforts and practices that challenge conventional norms and offer alternatives to organizing human activity without coercion, right? And in the United States in particular, a lot of folks have seldomly experienced meetings that are completely devoid of that kind of hierarchical structure, right? Where decision-making authority is concentrated in a singular boss or figure. The majority of people are obliged to navigate work environments characterized by rigid hierarchies, where deviating from established norms results in punishment or exclusion. And engaging in mutual aid endeavors has the potential to help instill courage and readiness to challenge unjust authority, unjust power dynamics as well, and taking collective risks for a common purpose can serve as a reparative experience, particularly for those accustomed to strict rule adherence. So now we're going to talk a bit more about the examples of mutual aid in the United States. We know that, again, it can be traced back to various social and cultural contexts, grounded in the idea that our communities can come together to provide support and assistance without relying on formal institutions, as well as hierarchical structures, right? Including indigenous and traditional societies. So many indigenous and traditional societies, including people of color, Black and brown folks, indigenous folks have a long history of practicing mutual aid. And in these communities, cooperation and mutual support are often fundamental values. The survival and well-being of the community depends on collective efforts and individuals contributing to the greater good. So here are some more historical examples of that. So this was more so in the United Kingdom, but in the 18th and the 19th centuries, there was the Friendly Societies and Mutual Benefit organizations in the context of industrialization, where workers formed these societies to pool resources, provide financial assistance in times of need, such as sickness or unemployment, and offering those kinds of social support networks, as well as labor movements and trade unions across the global South, Latin America, and even in places in the United States. The labor movement incorporated mutual aid principles, such as workers organized to improve working conditions, wages, and social protections. And trade unions served as mutual aid groups advocating for worker rights and providing assistance such as strike funds and healthcare benefits. Anarchist and socialist influences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So anarchist and socialist thinkers like Peter Kropotkin emphasized mutual aid as a key aspect for human cooperation, and their ideas influenced various social and political movements, highlighting the importance of decentralized cooperative structures in contrast to hierarchical ones, as well as civil rights and community organizing in the 20th century as well, right? Think about the 1960s onward into 1970s, where mutual aid principles were central to the civil rights movements and community organizing efforts, helping on or oftentimes relying on mutual support networks to navigate systemic challenges, provide resources, as well as security, right? Security from white supremacist groups, security from police forces. And later on in the 20th century, the feminist and LGBTQ movements embraced mutual aid as a means of addressing the specific needs and challenges faced by these communities, right? So think about, the rise of ballroom culture in the 80s and the 90s in New York, and Martha P. Johnson and other sex workers that helped spearhead those efforts, forming to provide resources, safe spaces, and advocacy for gender and sexual minorities. And digital age and contemporary mutual aid in the 21st century, especially 2020 and onward, seeing a resurgence of interest in mutual aid facilitated by Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Cash App, Venmo, forming online platforms to coordinate support. These initiatives oftentimes emphasize decentralized and community-driven responses, and wider global solidarity and transnational networks. Mutual aid has expanded beyond local communities to include global solidarity and networks collaborating across borders to address shared challenges, emphasizing the interconnectedness of social issues and the importance of collective action on a global scale. All right. So this is probably one of the biggest examples of mutual aid in the United States. Was from the Black Panther Party, right? So the Black Panther Party was a Marxist, Leninist, and Black Power political organization founded by college students Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in October 1966 in Oakland, California. The party was active in the United States between 1966 and 1982, with chapters in many American cities, including San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Philadelphia. And upon its inception, the party's core practice was cop watching, designed to challenge the excessive force and misconduct of the Oakland Police Department. And from 1969 and onwards, the party created social platforms, including the free breakfast for children programs, educational programs, and community health clinics. The Black Panther Party advocated for class struggle, claiming to represent the proletarian vanguard. And so what's interesting about the Black Panther Party survival program, including that kind of free breakfast program, is that actually later on in the United States, there were federal organizations that were inspired by the free breakfast program. And that's why you see across the United States those kinds of initiatives, as well as medical clinics. Also services offering rides to elderly people, doing errands, and a school aimed at providing a rigorous liberation curriculum to children. And the Black Panther Party welcomed people into the liberation struggle by creating spaces where they can meet basic needs and build a shared analysis about the conditions that they were facing. What a lot of people fail to recognize about the Black Panther Party is that, yes, they were very pro-Black liberation, but they were also very pro-collective liberation as well, right? one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, who was unfortunately targeted and killed by the FBI, Fred Hampton, he created an alliance called the Rainbow Coalition, where he was organizing with other Puerto Ricans and Cubans and what he would call redneck white folks from more rural areas. And they were bounding themselves together in the interconnectedness of their struggle and a need to create the systems that our government, that our current systems were not providing for these people. It also broke stigma and isolation. It also met material needs and got people fired up to work together for change. And so by the end of 1969, the Black Panthers were serving full free breakfast, including milk, bacon, eggs, grits, and toast to 20,000 school-aged children in 19 cities across the country and in 23 local affiliates every day. So it was over 60 survival programs at the height of the Black Panther Party movement in the United States, where rank and file members were serving their communities body and soul. And these kinds of revolutionary acts of washing pots, distributing shoes, transporting elders to the grocery store, as well as testing for sickle cell and offering culturally relevant schooling were transformative programs with deep and lasting change. Alrighty, so let's delve into the links between housing inequity and the increased vulnerability of disabled folks to sexual violence, right? So the CDC has highlighted housing instability as a key risk factor for sexual violence. Poverty is not only directly correlated with SV, sexual violence, but it's also linked to increased vulnerability, especially for folks with disabilities, do face a significantly higher likelihood of experiencing violence and are disproportionately affected by housing insecurity. And so these kinds of difficulties in securing housing makes it for, people with disabilities to face substantial obstacles, including an inability to find and keep affordable and safe housing, living under the continual threat of eviction, living in temporary housing like hotels, shelters, couch surfing, etc., the inability to comfortably afford rent and other utilities, the charging of basic housing needs and bills on credit cards, so they're racking up more debt, and the inability to leave a place that one feels unsafe due to lack of options, right? Which makes them significantly more vulnerable to facing domestic and sexual violence, okay? And so the intersection between housing and disability justice is significant, as individuals, like I was saying, can face unique challenges and barriers in accessing adequate and inclusive housing, increasing people's access to housing. Folks with disabilities access to housing is an important tool to prevent sexual violence because it addresses both risk and protective factors by fostering independence and autonomy and promoting a strong sense of community. Let me check the chat. Thank you, Sierra. Yes, please check out the chat. Here are some resources about housing as violence prevention. We also know that on a national scale, individuals with disabilities face significantly a higher likelihood of experiencing violence and are disproportionately affected by the increasing charging of rent and the housing crisis, okay? So enhancing accessibility to housing for people with disabilities emerges as a vital strategy in the prevention of sexual violence. And in the pursuit of a movement dedicating to eradicating sexual violence, it becomes an imperative to center the efforts of those most directly affected. Therefore, planning, leadership, and evaluation of such initiatives should be spearheaded by folks with disabilities themselves, allowing for there to be a more comprehensive and authentic approach. All right, forgive me, y'all. It's like I click, right? And my computer takes a minute. All right, so the links between housing inequity This is a more exhaustive list of the links between housing inequity and increased vulnerability of disabled folks to sexual violence. As we can see, like what we were saying, right? Limited access to safe and accessible housing, right? Think about how many buildings and houses that we see in apartment complexes that we see that don't have, escalators or walkable, spaceable hallways for folks in wheelchairs. Think about the dependence on caregivers and support services and how that oftentimes is very costly, right? As well as economic insecurity and social isolation, right? In the United States, we have a serious, I would say, epidemic of loneliness. And that is further exacerbated by the fact that we do not have proper, transits, public transit and infrastructure for buses. And so that exacerbates that, as well as barriers to reporting and seeking help, discrimination and stigmatizing folks with disabilities through ableism, as well as limited access to sex education. I do have to bring that up as a sex educator. When people do not have access to sex education, that kind of lack of education can contribute to a lack of knowledge about healthy relationships, consent, and strategies to prevent and respond to sexual violence. And so that is further exacerbated by the ongoing discrimination against folks with disabilities, contributing to a lack of awareness and understanding about the specific challenges faced by disabled individuals. So yeah, all of these issues can contribute furthermore to housing inequity and how that disproportionately affects folks with disabilities. Alrighty, and yes, please check out the link in the chat too that Sierra graciously provided of ICADV's report on survivor loneliness. Alrighty, so that goes into talking furthermore about the disability justice framework, okay? So disability justice promotes independent living, or interdependent living, I should say, and autonomy. So disability justice emphasizes the right to interdependent living and autonomy for folks with disabilities, right? Accessible and supportive housing allows people with disabilities to live independently and make choices about their living arrangements and participate fully in their communities, right? When we build community support networks, disability justice recognizes the importance of community support networks, which can be facilitated by inclusive housing environments. Housing that encourages social connections and community engagement can help combat isolation, fostering a sense of belonging and support with for individuals who are disabled, as well as advocacy. Disability justice advocates and oftentimes engages in communitarian-led efforts to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to housing opportunities. So this means enforcing existing anti-discrimination policies, advocating for stronger protections, and challenging policies that perpetuate housing inequalities, and through the building of tenant unions as well, right? Tenant unions is when a group of tenants of maybe one particular, apartment building, or, tenants that have the same landlord get together and they have a collective, ongoing list of demands that they make to their landlord, and that helps build collective power in communities, right? And if their landlord, their property manager does not meet the demands, they go together and they embark on a rent strike. Those kinds of movements have been becoming more popular across the United States. I am aware of a tenants union that is in Lafayette, Indiana, and they do really awesome work as well, right? And disability justice also recognizes the intersectionality of identities and the compounding impact of multiple marginalized experiences, right? So folks who are disabled, who are also parts of marginalized racial or LGBTQ communities, may face, on top of everything else, additional challenges in accessing safe, inclusive housing. So disability justice seeks to address these intersecting forms of oppression, right? And so the intersection between housing and disability justice highlights the need for inclusivity, accessibility, and housing rights that respects the autonomy and dignity of disabled folks. And by addressing these challenges through a disability justice lens, advocates help to create a more equitable and supporting living environment for everyone. And so with that being said, mutual aid can be particularly empowering for disabled folks by fostering community support, addressing specific needs, and challenging societal barriers, right? Because they're actually being included into the decision-making process, and they're actually being empowered by having their needs centered and met, right? Where oftentimes nonprofits do not consult with the communities that they are advocating for, right? So really think about that, about why it's so important to center the people who are the closest to the problems, because the people who are closest to the problems are going to be the folks closest to the solutions. And so here are some ways that mutual aid can help empower not only disabled folks, but also survivors, right? That kind of resource sharing and accessibility, skill and knowledge exchange, advocacy and collective action, assistance with daily living, crisis response and emergency preparedness, as well as offering educational opportunities to the community, like political analysis workshops, as well as accessible communication platforms and flexible and inclusive participation, right? So being able to be in a community where disabled folks can connect with others facing similar challenges, this sense of belonging can help provide emotional support, reduce isolation, and help build networks of people who understand and empathize with people's experiences, right? And through resource sharing, that can help facilitate the sharing of resources such as assistive devices, accessible transportation, or information about disability-friendly services, right? And this can help overcome financial barriers and ensure that folks with disabilities have access to the tools and resources that they need to help live fulfilling lives, right? And through this kind of skill and knowledge exchange, like I said, disabled folks oftentimes possess a wealth of knowledge and skills related to navigating their specific challenges, right? So mutual aid allows for the exchange of these skills within the community. So let's say someone who is, experienced in navigating healthcare systems or advocating for disability rights, they can help share their expertise and empower others, as well as that kind of collective action, right? So mutual aid groups can serve as platforms for collective advocacy, allowing for disabled folks to access common issues and advocate for systemic change. And so by coming together, they can amplify their voices, challenge discriminatory practices, and work towards a more inclusive and accessible environment, right? As well as that kind of assistance with daily living, providing practical assistance for that may be challenging, addressing the challenges that are faced by disabled folks. So this can include support for grocery shopping, transportation, household chores, and allowing individuals to maintain independence and quality of life, as well as crisis response and emergency preparedness. So in times of crises, such as, disasters that are created because of climate change or public health emergencies like COVID-19, mutual aid networks can play a crucial role in ensuring the safety and well-being of disabled individuals. And this kind of mobilization of resources and support can be especially vital during emergencies when traditional systems may fall short, right? And so providing as well those kinds of educational opportunities for disabled folks, including workshops, training sessions, and mentoring programs, this can help empower them about their rights, available services, as well as self-advocacy skills. And when mutual aid groups utilize accessible community platforms or communication platforms, taking into account various communication needs, including ASL, including Spanish or other languages, this can help ensure that information and discussions are accessible to folks with different disabilities, helping furthermore promote inclusivity and participation. And when we are being flexible and inclusive in these efforts, this can help accommodate diverse abilities and preferences, allowing folks to participate in ways that, suit their needs, and helping that everyone can contribute and benefit from the collective efforts of the community. And so let's talk about pod mapping. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, another intersection between mutual aid and the prevention of sexual violence emerged through the implementation of pod mapping. So this was originally created by educator and community organizer Mia Mingus in collaboration with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. So this serves as a practical tool for folks to identify a social network for addressing violent or harmful or abusive experiences, whether as survivors, bystanders, or community folks who have caused harm as well. This approach encourages people to proactively recognize and discuss the skills that could be beneficial in a crisis with those within their social circles before the need arises. So helping, potentially escape a situation that could escalate, right? So this becomes a very valuable resource for applying the principles of collective care to foster support and accountability concerning violence and abuse. And so throughout the challenges posed by the pandemic, pod mapping underwent adaptation, and it was shared as a versatile tool for establishing relationships in various mutual aid communities, okay? And because a pod is a microsystem of the community, it's easier to get organized, to connect, to make a plan, to follow through if and when it's needed. And there may be certain qualities that folks may look for others. Maybe they're easily reliable, well-resourced, generous, committed, kind. Maybe they have certain skills that you don't or do need. Maybe they live nearby, right? And so with that being said, let's explain about this worksheet that I posted here, right? So someone would write their name in the middle of the gray area. And so the surrounding bolded outline circles are folks in your pod, right? So someone would write the names of the people that are in their pod. This framework encourages folks to write the names of actual individuals instead of things like my neighbors, or something big like my church group or my mosque group. You would write specific individuals, right? Whereas the dotted lines surrounding the pod are folks that are movable. So these are people that could be quote unquote moved in your pod, but maybe need a little more work. So for example, you might need to build, a deeper relationship or trust with them, or maybe you've never had a conversation with them about prisons or sexual violence. Whereas the larger circles in the edge of the page are for networks, communities, or groups that could be resources for you. It could be, your local domestic violence direct service organization, or your cohort in school, or a transformative justice group. All right. And so this is a very adaptable framework because it can shift over time as someone's needs or relationships shift, or as someone's geographic location shifts. So we encourage people to have conversations with their pod folks about pods, about disability justice, as well as how to actively grow the number of folks in their pod and support each other in doing so, right? Growing someone's pod is not easy and may take time, right? Especially, for folks like us that live in Indiana, where there are a lot of obstacles in a city like Indianapolis, for example, where it's not as walkable, where there's not as much reliable transportation. And so in pod work, someone would measure the success by the quality of the relationships with one another and how we invest in the time to build things like vulnerability, respect, trust, accountability, care, and love towards one another. And so this is a concrete way to prepare and build resources for transformative justice, for disability justice in our communities. All right. And so these are examples or other ways to sustain mutual aid networks a good example of that is direct cash assistance programs. And so in my beginning of the webinar, when I was introducing myself to you all, I was telling you all that I have 6+ years of experience of community organizing. And that includes a lot of direct cash assistance programs. So when you have people that you trust in your pod, in your community, when they feel comfortable enough to tell you, hey, I'm really short on rent this month, or hey, I've got a big, flipping healthcare bill coming up and I need help. What folks can do for one another is being able to crowd raise money for another community member, right? Because oftentimes there's a lot of obstacles, there's a lot of difficulty for people to get the services they need, and that can put them in a more vulnerable position into getting evicted, right? Whereas when, people are, having shared and built trust with one another and understand the urgency of the situation, they're better able to just, get on Canva, make a flyer. Hey, so-and-so needs support right now, so-and-so was just hospitalized for X, Y, and Z, and you're able to consult that person. Hey, can I use your name? Or hey, do you not want me to use your name? Or maybe that person's undocumented, right? And it may not be the most appropriate to blast their name out like that, but they need support, right? And so people, because they have that trust and support in one another, they understand that that kind of money that's being sent to that Venmo is going directly to pay someone else's utility bill or health bill. As well as providing information and about resources and disrupt gatekeeping, right? There's a lot of gatekeeping that happens, especially in the field. And so mutual aid helps disrupt gatekeeping by being able to share information about resources, right? Like when I worked at Purdue University, I had a friend of mine in the community that provides free therapy services for folks. And I knew that they were short on their bills, right? Because they don't charge people to access therapy. And so I was not made aware that at the time there were some instances within Purdue where people were able to get their bills paid through the university because there was, COVID-19 funds. And so I was someone working within the institution, within the system. So I was able to disrupt that gatekeeping and being like, hey, there's this available, right? That's a good example of providing resources or providing information about resources and disrupting that kind of gatekeeping, as well as drop-off sites for essential goods, right? So maybe there's a coffee shop that you have a great relationship with the baristas, and you could say, hey, we're trying to collect goods for houseless folks, right? And so, the coffee shop can say, to their customers, hey, if you have some sweaters or coats, please drop them off here and we'll distribute them to the folks that need it. That's a good example, right? As well as providing tech, right? Maybe there are some activists and organizers that are doing really important work on the front lines and they need burner phones, right? We live in a surveillance, state. So being able to provide tech, that's another example, as well as advocating with funders to be able to redirect organizational resources to provide direct financial, housing, and material support. Okay. So that, really applies to folks that, work in a nonprofit, that work in direct services, is being able to use your position, use your current role to advocate for those kinds of things. Okay. So here are some more examples of mutual aid. Grocery store trips and prep, as well as childcare, right? We live in a country where childcare is extremely expensive for a lot of folks, right? So, we're in winter time, right? There's going to be more snow days. So, being able to provide childcare for when folks are working and do not have anywhere else to drop off their kids, that's a great example of that, right? Picking up medicine or other, essential errands. I'm going to share a moment of vulnerability here. I have been dealing with, mental health issues related to anxiety, to depression. And so sometimes, picking up medicine as something as, quote unquote, small as that can come really overwhelming for me because I'm someone who works, 2 to 3 jobs and I am tired. And it's really difficult to go to the pharmacy at times because, sometimes things are not run through the health insurance and you have to go on a back and forth to reduce the cost of your medication. And that debilitates me, right? So it was really kind of, my brother, for example, to go to the pharmacy to pick up my antidepressants. And I've been able to do better ever since, so that's really important. You never know what other people are going through. And a lot of people assume that, my capacity or my ability to do things is higher. But then when it comes to moments like that, it's really difficult for me, right? So being able to do that for others is really important, as well as me, maybe buying cleaning supplies, right? Or financial support, emotional support, being able to offer mental health counseling. So I always tell, therapists and social workers in the field of like, if you really care about equity, try to build your capacity where you're able to, pick up clientele for free or pay scale services, right? That's another way of doing it, right? Maybe hosting recreational activities or, language translation and support. So when I still lived in my hometown of Louisville, I used to go into, one of the Latino community centers and help translate for folks who are undocumented and help, accompany them when they had to go do check-ins with, immigration, customs, and enforcement, things like that, right? So there are a limit, an infinite number of examples of mutual aid that can be done within community. And I hope that I've given you all an example, just some examples of how to do that interpersonally and within your work in nonprofits, as social workers, as violence preventionists, or public health educators. Thank you, Celine, for that really kind comment. Let me go on to the last slide. I don't know why my computer's doing this. I have to like click a bajillion times to go to the next slide. So with that being said, thank you so much for attending the webinar today. Please check out the Indiana Disability Justice Hub platforms and other Indiana organizations that are doing really dope work advocating for disability justice as well as a free Palestine. So here are some Instagram links. And I'm sharing Instagram because I, in particular, am most active on Instagram. Ever since Elon Musk bought Twitter, I just can't do Twitter. But maybe some of these organizations also have Twitter or Facebook. But I know that Indiana Disability Justice is on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. So here are our handles. I also want to uplift SJP Purdue, so Students for Justice in Palestine Purdue. One of our of the lovely organizers with SJP is in attendance today. So thank you so much, Johnny, for having attended, as well as SJP Butler, so Students for Justice in Palestine at Butler University. They've been doing a lot of actions at the Fountain Monument. I think that's what it's called, the monument in downtown Indianapolis. They've been doing a lot of that there, as well as in other places, as well as the Middle Eastern Student Organization at IUPUI and Jewish Voices for Peace Indiana. They've been posting a lot of actions in Lafayette, in Indianapolis, in Bloomington. I believe like a month or two ago, they did an action in Chicago with other comrades in the movement. And so please tap in, please pay attention to what's going on in the world. Do not fall into apathy or despair. That does not help advance our goals of disability justice and collective liberation. Here are also my email address. So if you all have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at this. And that is what I have for you all today. I wanted to leave time for any kind of comments or questions. So yeah, thank you all so much for attending.